Welcome to the first episode of Washington Talk in 2019. I'm Eun-jung Cho. In his New Year's address, Chairman Kim said he was ready to meet with President Trump. But when it comes to specific denuclearization steps, Chairman Kim echoed his previous comments. Were there signs in this speech that he is serious about denuclearization?
더 이상 핵무기를 만들지도 시험하지도 않는 진정성은 또 한 번의 역사. 제재와 압박으로 나간다면 우리로서도 어쩔 수 없이 새로운 길을 모색하지 않을 수 없게 될 수도 있습니다.
So I look forward to our meeting with Chairman Kim. We'll set that up. We'll be setting it up in the not too distant future.
In the studio with me today, Mr. Mark Fitzpatrick, former Executive Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies Americas. Mr. Fitzpatrick was Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Non-Proliferation. Also joining me today, Mr. Frank Jannuzi, President of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thanks. Nice to be here.
Now, Chairman Kim Jong-un, in his New Year's address, what was his key message to the United States?
I think it was largely a message of continuity. North Korea remains committed to a long-term process of denuclearization and peace, but all of the specifics remain to be negotiated. And also, I think Kim Jong-un wanted to remind President Trump and the United States that his patience and the patience of North Korea is not infinite. If they don't see corresponding measures taken by the United States to reciprocate what they believe to be meaningful gestures of peace and denuclearization, then Kim Jong-un basically signaled that the North was prepared to revisit their commitment and to reevaluate their options in the new year.
Mm-hmm. What did you think was the key message?
Well, I agree with Frank. It was interesting also that it was largely positive. In the lead up to the speech, there had been commentary from the North Korean state news media that was getting more and more harsh. And these statements about they don't want to see Pompeo, they just want to talk with President Trump. But this speech was reaching out to him, and there was nothing really too negative about the United States. It was a message, as Frank said, of, look, we've done a lot, it's your turn to reciprocate. They're waiting for the United States to reciprocate on their terms.
Mm-hmm. So you said it was largely positive, but North Korea did mention about this new path that it could take. Was this a threat, and what could this new path be?
Well, I think that the new path is the old path. It's the path that we saw throughout 2016, 2017, when dozens of missiles were being tested, three nuclear weapons tests in that span of time. And they're signaling that they could go back to that if there's not reciprocity. Now, their idea of reciprocity is highly exaggerated.
Mm-hmm. So in this speech, Chairman Kim Jong-un also reiterated his commitment to denuclearize, but how was this time different from previous times?
Well, this time around, Eun-jung, Kim Jong-un avoided any specific reference to the steps that the United States needed to take to sort of make the peace process viable. Maybe he thinks he's said enough about that already to communicated the needs of the North Korean state. But it may also be that they're still really evaluating their wish list. There was reference to sanctions relief. There was reference to the kind of security assurances that the North expects to have. But I got the feeling that North Korea was not certain about how to prioritize their own requirements as part of this peace and denuclearization process. In particular, I found the references to the economic future of North Korea interesting, because I think that North Korea continues to want to pivot away from a priority on their military development toward economic growth. And I think Kim Jong-un has a dawning awareness that doing that successfully is going to require sanctions relief and support from South Korea and the United States.
And also in the speech, North Korea said it will not make or test or use or proliferate its nuclear weapons. And what is your take on that?
That was the most interesting thing to me. That first verb, will not make. The rest of it about not using, testing, proliferating, they had said before, specifically last April. But not making is something they hadn't said before. And it's directly opposite to what he had said in last year's New Year's speech when he talked about mass production of nuclear weapons. Now, not making them. And then he put it in the past tense as well. He said, we have declared. I never saw any place that he had previously declared. What exactly it means, nobody knows. To make, does it mean to develop new kinds of weapons? Does it mean no new fissile material at Yongbyon or some other place? There's a lot to be explored here.
I think Mark's picked up on a point that many analysts have missed. This pledge not to make new weapons, it does need to be explored by the U.S. negotiating team, but it could be a significant gesture by the North because up until this point, the North, as far as I know, had offered no assurances that they were not, as we speak, producing new nuclear weapons. So if, in fact, the North has suspended the production of nuclear weapons, that's a meaningful step.
Talking about the steps, North Korea didn't come up with any new steps, any specific new steps. So is Kim Jong-un saving this for another summit with President Trump, or is he setting the grounds for a very protracted process?
Well, it's always a bad idea to negotiate with yourself, and I think that North Korea doesn't want to make any concessions up front before they sit down with President Trump, possibly on a second summit, or sit down with Steve Biegun at a working level. So I think they're just keeping their cards very close to their chest right now. They don't want to give away any concessions in advance of the next round of talks.
And in the speech, Kim Jong-un said it'll be a denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. So what does this mean? Does this mean North Korea wants to remove the nuclear umbrella over South Korea?
Well, denuclearization of the Korean peninsula is, of course, North Korea's tried and true phrase. They use it all the time. It always means not just their nukes, but primarily nuclear weapons, which they claim are stored in South Korea. They haven't been there since 1991. And more recently, they've been talking about nuclear threats emanating from nearby areas, which could mean anything. It could mean missiles in Guam. It could mean ICBMs launched from the United States. But one thing about this, the Korean peninsula phraseology connected with denuclearization, in the English version that the North Koreans released, it didn't actually say that phrase. They didn't tie denuclearization to the Korean peninsula. They stopped and put a period after denuclearization. So that's something that our colleague Bob Carlin picked up on in a commentary this morning in 38 North.
Now, Secretary Pompeo said that President Trump will meet with Chairman Kim in the next short period of time. Do you expect the summit to be held in January or February, as President Trump previously said?
Well, the indications I'm getting by talking to U.S. officials as well as South Korean officials is that they believe a summit in January is very unlikely. I think a summit in February is possible, but frankly, I think even that may be overly optimistic. This next summit really needs to produce, in my view, some concrete results. And for that to happen, there have to be some preparatory talks because Donald Trump is not going to negotiate specific denuclearization steps with Chairman Kim. So I'll be more able to give you an assessment of the timeline once we see that first round of meaningful working level talks. And frankly, I don't expect that to happen until February.
So by the end of the second summit, do you expect North Korea and the United States to kind of solve the sequencing problem to give and take?
Oh, I don't think they'll solve anything at the second summit. Although I just will say one thing. If Donald Trump wants a second summit, he won't listen to his staff. He'll go ahead and do it like he's been doing with more frequency of late. So I wouldn't bet against a second summit happening in February. The results of it, it'll be a vague outcome, like the Singapore summit, and both sides will read into it what they want. Will they solve the sequencing? Donald Trump may give away the store, and it's really unpredictable what will come out of it.
Now, Kim Jong-un demanded the resumption of the Kaesong Industrial Complex and also tours to Mount Kumgang. It seems like Chairman Kim is adding more and more of his demands. So what is his strategy?
Well, I think, Yoon Jung, that Chairman Kim really wants to be able to show some tangible benefits to his own people, especially the elite in Pyongyang. So I think it's part of this peace initiative was undertaken by Chairman Kim and President Moon to deliver real benefits to the people on both sides of the 38th parallel. So I think that Chairman Kim wants the sanctions relief, Kumgang Mountain, Kaesong Industrial Complex, because he wants to be able to start showing some of the fruit of peace to his own people.
And what Chairman Kim also asked for is to stop military exercises between the United States and South Korea and not bring in any military equipment into South Korea, some strategic assets. Why is he making this demand now when the military exercises have already stopped?
Well, the exercises have only been suspended, of course, and there had been some question about whether the winter exercises would also be suspended as the last summer's exercises were. And as for the strategic equipment, he's not demanding that all U.S. Supplied military hardware be cut off. He's talking about strategic assets, and they've said that before. Strategic assets usually means the aircraft that are nuclear capable, like the B-52s and the stealth bombers, and then any submarines that might be nuclear capable, which don't call in South Korea anyway. So I don't think this is a new demand. It's something that they've said before.
So how should South Korea respond to North Korea's such requests?
I think the key point for South Korea is that matters related to the alliance with the United States really belong in the bilateral South Korea-U.S. channel. And South Korea should not negotiate with North Korea the terms of U.S. exercises or force posture on the peninsula. It's really inappropriate for North Korea to expect that. That doesn't stop them from asking, but it should stop South Korea from answering.
So from this latest New Year's address, we don't see any tangible signs that North Korea is really sincere about denuclearization. So going forward, how should the United States strategize?
Well, I think it's really important to probe what does North Korea mean by not making nuclear weapons. That's a very significant verb, and it's so ambiguous. You know, North Korea had earlier said that they would be willing to permanently shutter the Yongbyon nuclear complex. So that would mean no more production of plutonium, no more reprocessing of plutonium, no more uranium enrichment at Yongbyon. Those would be very significant. And if that's what he means by not making any more nuclear weapons, that needs to be clarified. And then what would be the corresponding measures that are required? The United States, as you had referred to earlier, has had the sequencing issue that they want North Korea to do everything first, only after which sanctions relief would come. And if there's going to be real negotiations, there has to be some simultaneity. North Korea does something, the United States does something, a sort of a stage-by-stage approach, which was also something that North Korea has also been suggesting.
And let me suggest, Yoon Jung, that I'm not sure we really should be trying to assess North Korea's sincerity. I'm not sure we'll ever get clarity on that point. I think what we can judge is their actions. And if, as Mark suggests, they may be willing, under certain circumstances, to really significantly suspend operations at Yongbyon in terms of fissile material production, that's worth exploring. And Kim Jong-un himself may not have made the decision one way or the other about the ultimate disposition of his nuclear forces. But let's see if we can't make some progress on the first tasks.
So in this top-down diplomacy, do you think the second summit will give an added boost to give any momentum to this process?
I'm afraid I agree with Mark. I'm skeptical. I worry that the second summit will be much like the first, full of ambiguity, and both sides reading into it exactly what they want to read into it. On the other hand, let's remember that as long as this diplomatic dance goes on, we are enjoying lower tension, lower threat escalation, and an opportunity to get to know each other better and build a peace process. So it's better than the alternative.
Just quickly, you are a career diplomat, so I wanted to ask you this. High-ranking North Korea's diplomat to Italy is now suspected to be seeking an asylum. So what does this say about the timing? The day after the great leader delivers a speech, top-level diplomat seeks asylum. What do you say to that?
I'm not sure that there's any significance to the timing, but the very fact of the apparent defection, I think is a very interesting sign. I was in London when Tae Yong-ho defected, and I got the impression that any North Korean diplomat, if given the chance, if he had his family intact and he could defect without bringing a calamity on family members, would do so. Because they're overseas, they see how free the rest of the world is, they know their own system is corrupt, and to have to bring back their children who have been educated in the West back to that corrupt system where they could be thrown in prison at any whim of an authority, I think they would defect. And I suspect that's what happened in this case. He probably had his family with him. He had a chance during the vacations to buy some time by saying he's going on vacation and then defect. And I applaud that, frankly. I think the more defections, the better.
Well, we'll have to leave it here and watch video for our next discussion.
아무런 전제 조건이나 대가 없이 개성공업지구와 금강산 관광을 재개할 용의가 있습니다.
Chairman Kim Jong-un said considering the difficult situation of South Korean businessmen, he is ready to resume Kaesong Industrial Complex and tours to Mount Kumgang without conditions. Now, why did he put it this way? Doesn't North Korea want this more than South Korea?
Well, of course they do. And this is a question of North Korean pride. You know, when you go into the bazaar, you're supposed to haggle. But in this case, North Korea is essentially in the bazaar of sanctions and diplomatic rapprochement with South Korea. They want South Korea to be the one that is making the demands of the North, not the other way around. But in fact, what this signifies is North Korea's eagerness to see their economy revive, eagerness to get sanctions relief and to get investment and jobs and money for everything from luxury goods to other needs that the leadership has. And I think it's a really good sign. It's good that North Korea be focused on their economic performance, because as long as that is their priority, it suggests that the United States and the international community has leverage over them and can trade improved circumstances for their economic growth in exchange for the kind of security steps that we want them to take. And so I'll be more worried if I see signs that North Korea is uninterested in their economic performance. I think that would be a danger sign.
And could I say, by focusing on the Kaesong Industrial Zone and the Kumgangsan, I think North Korea is also appealing to domestic opinion in South Korea, because many South Koreans want this resumed as well. And it's a point of contention between South Korea and the United States.
Yes.
South Korea can't do that unless they get an exemption from the UN sanctions, which the United States and other parties are not ready to give. But the more that North Korea can appeal to that South Korean sentiment, they're driving a wedge between the United States and South Korea. That's another long-term objective of Kim Jong-un.
But tours to Mount Kumgang was stopped in 2008 as a South Korean tourist was shot, and Kaesong Industrial Complex stopped in 2016 because there were fears that the money was going into developing missile and nuclear programs. So shouldn't North Korea rectify its wrongdoings first?
Well, they should, but they're not going to, at least not overtly. I think it's possible that quietly, north-south, there may be certain assurances that the North can provide. For instance, on the safety of anyone traveling to Mount Kumgang. South Korea is not going to want to resume such activities with or without sanctions waivers until they can be confident that South Korean citizens are going to be safe in North Korea. And so I think the North is going to have to provide some kind of quiet assurances, but for them to do so publicly or to apologize publicly, I think that's a bridge too far.
So how much of these two projects are impacted by the UN and US sanctions?
Well, they're totally impacted, really. The most that President Moon Jae-in can do is to lay out the potential for resuming them, to kind of show that there's a real potential here as an incentive to North Korea to take some steps toward denuclearization that would then allow the UN Security Council to say, okay, then we'll let you to go forward with this. My fear is that South Korea, if they the domestic opinion were to get so great that they want to do this, they would say, well, it doesn't, UN sanctions don't really apply to us because we're a part of a unified Korea, and sanctions apply to international trade. This isn't international trade. They could try to come up with some legal loophole, which would be, in my view, a huge violation and a huge problem for U.S.-South Korea relations.
Mm-hmm. So if that happens, do you expect another round of disconnect between Washington and Seoul in 2019?
If that happens, if the South in fact pushes ahead with projects like Kaesong, absent significant steps by the North on denuclearization, then yes, that's going to open up quite a large gulf between Washington and Seoul. I don't think it will happen. I think the coordination process between Washington and Seoul is pretty strong. I think that Steve Biegun has been traveling over there a lot. Mark Lambert, the Korea desk officer at the State Department, has been traveling regularly. And I think that the higher level, Pompeo and even Trump, Moon Jae-in, there's a lot of coordination going on. So I think the South will stay in its lane, but those pressures are going to build.
Frank is right. The coordination has been very close, and Moon Jae-in is not foolish. He knows the importance of the U.S. strategic alliance, and at the working level, they all know it. There's a wild card here, though, that I worry about, and it's the negotiations over the cost of supporting U.S. troops in South Korea, which were supposed to have been completed by December 31st, and they weren't. The two sides were very far apart. And, President Trump is disinclined to keep those troops there anyway. He'd like to pull them out. And I would not discount the possibility of him doing so. That kind of a wild card, an abrupt change in the military relationship, would affect other things. And maybe it would give Moon Jae-in reason to say, well, if Trump was unilateral there, we can be unilateral in making going to reopen Kaesong.
Mark raises a really critical point that we should keep in mind for the entirety of this year ahead, Yoon Jung, which is that with Donald Trump in the White House, I don't think any of us can have confidence that we know the path that the United States is on. Trump has shown with Syria and Afghanistan policy that he's prepared to make radical changes unilaterally in U.S. security force postures. And the same could be true on the Korean Peninsula. So, I think we need to buckle up because President Trump is capable of moving radically in the new year.
But there's a National Security Advisor and Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, and I think President Trump will listen to his advisors and chart his way forward, and we'll leave it here and move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a picture, Chairman Kim bringing a new look to his New Year's address. He ditched a podium and sat on a leather chair in a study. Some analysts say this reminded them of a fireside chat. Some point to the possibility that his health may have prevented him from standing for a long time. Frank, what's your reaction?
Well, it's a warm setting, but there are things about it that are sort of incongruous or maybe a little bit poorly staged. I think Chairman Kim looks small in that chair, and maybe the armrests are a little too high. It's almost like he's confined within it. I like the library setting. I think that signals a kind of a civilian focus. But other aspects of this strike me as just kind of bizarre. And I'm not sure that it works from a messaging standpoint.
Mark?
Well, I agree with Frank. The civilian aspect of this emphasizes that his priority is the economy, not the military. There's very little, as I can see, any references to military apparatus in here. I mean, you've got these books which we were looking at and wondering, are they fake? Probably these are fake books, but anyway, it's a nice setting. And I give Kim Jong-un credit for doing something new, a new look in 2019.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we'll get another new look in 2020. And on that point, Frank, Mark, thank you for joining us.
Yoon Jung, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.